Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. They came for his land. They forged documents, bulldozed fences, and left him bleeding in the dirt. But what they didn't know was that he had nothing left to lose. This is the story of one man versus a corrupt HOA and the war that shook the entire community. Ethan Walker had spent the last 5 years cultivating more than just crops. He'd built a life rooted in rhythm, trust, and quiet purpose. Nestled at the edge of Madison County, his 70-acre farm had been in his family for 3 generations. Rows of corn stretched beside hand-built greenhouses. A cluster of chickens wandered the yard, and a small herd of dairy goats grazed lazily on the eastern hill. To Ethan, this land was more than property. It was legacy. Despite the rural setting, a large planned community, Sunridge Hills, bordered the southern edge of his land. Years ago, when the HOA first approached Ethan, they'd suggested he join their association and adhere to their neighborhood standards. He'd politely declined, wanting no part in their rules or politics. But then something rare happened: mutual respect. Instead of conflict, they struck an informal agreement. Ethan would supply fresh produce, eggs, honey, and dairy directly to HOA residents at a reasonable rate, and in return he'd have a loyal customer base and steady income. It was simple, handshake business, built on trust. The former HOA president, Tom Delaney, was a retired school principal with a steady temperament and a healthy respect for boundaries. Tom never tried to control Ethan's operations. On the contrary, he often praised Ethan's work ethic and took pride in supporting local agriculture. Over the years, their relationship became more than transactional. It was a neighborly alliance. Every Thursday, Ethan would load his pickup with crates of farm goods, drive the short distance to Sunridge's community center, and deliver his harvest. Smiles, nods, and the occasional pie and thanks. These were the rhythms of peace. But peace, like crops, could be fragile. And though Ethan didn't know it yet, change was coming. Fast. Entitled, and wearing designer sunglasses. The first time Ethan met Karen Mitchell, he sensed something was off. It was in the way she introduced herself, not as a neighbor, not as a resident of Sunridge Hills, but as the newly elected president of the HOA. She walked up his gravel path like she owned it, clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched like a crown. Her smile was practiced, tight around the edges. "I've heard a lot about you, Mr. Walker," she said, not offering her hand. "I'm hoping we can take a more formal approach to our relationship moving forward." Ethan, leaning against the fence post he'd just repaired, raised an eyebrow. "Formal?" Karen nodded briskly. "You've been supplying our residents for years without a formal contract or oversight. That needs to change. I'd like to invite you to officially join the HOA. That way, we can ensure compliance, pricing fairness, and community standards." He gave a quiet chuckle. "Appreciate the offer, but I'm not interested in joining. The land isn't part of Sunridge Hills, and I'm not looking to change how I do business." Karen's smile didn't falter, but her eyes sharpened. "Well, I do appreciate your honesty. Of course, it's your choice." That choice had consequences. Within the week, the weekly supply arrangement was abruptly canceled. Residents began receiving mass emails stating that the HOA was seeking a new vendor with proper documentation and competitive pricing. Ethan wasn't surprised, but he was disappointed. He'd come to appreciate the connection, the sense of community. Still, he wasn't about to beg. Weeks passed. Ethan adjusted, taking his goods to local farmers markets and restaurants instead. But something in Karen's tone had stuck with him. Something too rehearsed, too transactional. He'd seen ambition before, but Karen didn't just want order. She wanted control. So when she returned one foggy morning, pulling up in a spotless white SUV and stepping out in a suit far too formal for farmland, Ethan's guard was already up. This time, there was no small talk. "Mr. Walker," she said, pulling a folder from her bag. "After a review of our records, we've discovered that 30 acres of the land you're using are actually within the boundaries of Sunridge Hills. Technically, that land belongs to the HOA." Ethan froze. "That's not possible." Karen tilted her head. "I'm trying to resolve this amicably. If you're willing to reestablish our agreement with a 50% discount moving forward, we won't escalate. Otherwise, we'll be forced to act." It wasn't a negotiation, it was a threat. Ethan had faced droughts, livestock illnesses, and brutal winters, but nothing had prepared him for the surreal confrontation unfolding on his front porch. Karen stood stiffly across from him, arms crossed, lips curled in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She held the same sleek folder from earlier, only now she opened it deliberately, extracting what looked like a plat map and a printed HOA boundary chart. "These 30 acres," she said, tapping with a manicured nail, "have been miscategorized. According to this updated land use survey, they fall within the extended jurisdiction of Sunridge Hills." Ethan took the paper, scanning it carefully. It looked official, too official, but he knew every fence post, every surveyed corner of his land. His grandfather had walked these borders before zoning maps ever existed. "That's not correct," he said calmly. "This land's been in my family since long before Sunridge Hills was even a concept. It's private property. Always has been." Karen gave a soft, patronizing laugh. "That may have been true once, but things change. Boundaries shift. Records evolve." "And yet my deed hasn't," Ethan replied, narrowing his eyes. "I'll have my attorney verify this." Karen didn't flinch. In fact, she seemed almost amused. "Of course, take your time, but I'd advise you to think about what non-compliance could mean. Disputes like this, they can get very expensive, very fast." With that, she turned and left, her heels clicking on the porch as if she'd already won. Ethan spent the next 2 days in a haze of paperwork and phone calls. His attorney, a seasoned property rights specialist named Deborah Barnes, pored over the title history, county maps, and legal archives. Her verdict was immediate and firm. "This is your land, Ethan. Every inch of it. Whatever she's waving around is either fabricated or wildly misinterpreted." Relieved but uneasy, Ethan printed multiple certified copies of his deed, zoning exemption documents, and a highlighted county map. When Karen returned, uninvited, the following afternoon, he was ready. She didn't even knock, just walked up the porch steps like she owned the place. "I take it you've had time to review," she said smugly. Ethan handed her the documents. "This is my land, and you have no legal authority over it. I suggest you stop whatever it is you're trying to pull before it gets you into real trouble." Karen didn't even look at the papers. She laughed, a dry, chilling sound. "Oh, Ethan, you really don't get it. You've got 2 options. You either resume supplying goods to the HOA at a 50% markdown, or I make this messy. Very messy. I've got people in zoning, in permitting, even friends in the assessor's office. I can bury you in legal red tape for years. You'll be too broke to plant a seed." Ethan's jaw clenched. "Are you blackmailing me?" Karen's smile turned wolfish. "Call it strategic community management." Rage surged through him like wildfire. "Get off my property now." She held up her hands in mock surrender. "Fine, but don't say I didn't give you a chance." As her SUV disappeared down the road, Ethan stood motionless, fists shaking, heart racing. This wasn't about land anymore. It was about power. And she had just declared war. The call came just after sunrise, crackling through Ethan's old landline with a kind of urgency that made his gut clench. It was Marlene, a longtime acquaintance and one of the few Sunridge Hills HOA members he genuinely trusted. Her voice was breathless, tight with panic. "Ethan, it's your land, the South Field. There's equipment out there, heavy machinery. I was walking my dog when I saw it. Bulldozers, graders, they're tearing it up." Ethan's coffee slipped from his hand, shattering on the tile floor. He was in his truck within 2 minutes, tires spitting gravel as he roared down the winding dirt road that led to the lower 30 acres. The rising sun cast long shadows across the landscape, but even from a distance, Ethan could see them. Massive machines carving trenches through his alfalfa field like it was a construction site. He slammed on the brakes near the tree line and jumped out before the truck fully stopped. Dust curled around his boots as he ran toward the site, dialing 911 as he went. "There's unauthorized construction on private property," he barked into the phone. "This is a land seizure in progress. I need officers dispatched now." When he reached the field, his worst fears solidified. 2 bulldozers, a backhoe, and a crew of men in neon vests were methodically stripping the land bare. His irrigation lines had been ripped up, fence posts crushed into the soil, saplings uprooted. A cold fist tightened around his heart as he spotted a familiar figure standing on a nearby rise, arms folded with smug satisfaction. Karen. She was wearing a tan pantsuit and a wide-brimmed hat, as if this were some glamorous unveiling. When she saw Ethan, her face lit up with fake surprise. "Oh, perfect timing," she called out cheerfully. "You can witness the transition. Your land's going to be so much more useful now." "What the hell are you doing?" Ethan shouted, breathless with disbelief. "This is my land." Karen shrugged. "We both know that's debatable." Ethan stormed toward one of the bulldozers and flagged down the operator. "Cut the engine, now! This is private property and you're trespassing." The man hesitated, glancing over at Karen. "Ma'am," he called. "Keep going," she snapped. "He's bluffing." Ethan stepped closer to the machine, grabbing the man's arm. "I'm not bluffing. You're violating federal property laws, and you're going to jail unless you shut this down immediately." The operator pulled his arm free and shoved Ethan backward. "Don't touch me." Before Ethan could react, two more crew members rushed in. One of them, stocky in a dirty ball cap, swung first, landing a blow across Ethan's jaw that sent him sprawling to the ground. Then the kicks came. Hard and fast, boots to ribs, fists to shoulders. "Get off him!" shouted someone from behind. A neighbor, a passerby, someone who had seen enough. Phones were out. People were filming. Several bystanders surged forward, trying to help, but one of the crewmen lifted a shovel and brandished it threateningly. "Back off," he barked. "This is a work zone," Karen began shrieking. "This is sabotage. He's attacking contracted workers. This is criminal interference." But her hysteria was drowned out by sirens. Two sheriff's department vehicles barreled down the access road, dust clouds rolling behind them. The deputies emerged fast and hard, weapons holstered but hands ready. Orders were shouted. The machines shut down. The workers dropped tools. The scene froze in chaos. Karen was still shouting when they cuffed her. "I'm the president of the HOA," she screamed. "You have no authority over me. This land is part of our—" "That's enough," one officer snapped, cutting her off mid-rant. Ethan sat on the ground, battered and bruised, blinking in disbelief. As the chaos finally began to settle, one deputy knelt beside him. "You all right, sir?" "I'm alive," Ethan muttered, tasting blood. "That's more than I can say for my land." As Karen was led to the back of the squad car, she twisted to look at him, hatred gleaming in her eyes. "This isn't over," she hissed. But in that moment, with the cameras rolling, neighbors staring, and the truth laid bare in torn soil and shattered fencing, Ethan knew she was wrong. It was over. For her. The bruises on Ethan's ribs were still tender when the first legal motions were filed. His attorney, Deborah Barnes, wasted no time. Within 48 hours of the assault and destruction, she had submitted a restraining order against Karen Mitchell and the Sunridge Hills HOA, as well as a formal civil complaint for trespassing, property damage, and assault by proxy. It wasn't just a lawsuit, it was a declaration of war through the courts. But Deborah knew this wasn't a simple case of trespass or physical assault. "We're not just going after them for swinging fists and bulldozing crops," she told Ethan as they sat in her office, surrounded by thick case files and half-empty coffee mugs. "We're going to expose a fraudulent land grab, systemic abuse of authority, and criminal conspiracy." Karen's downfall had begun the moment the police cuffed her in full view of the community. But the investigation that followed would unearth far deeper corruption than Ethan or anyone had imagined. The forged land records she'd waved so confidently on his porch? Fakes. County officials confirmed that the boundary map had been altered digitally and printed to resemble a legitimate planning document. A closer inspection revealed discrepancies in coordinates, incorrect stamps, and most damning of all, the signature of a zoning official who had retired 3 years earlier. Whoever had created it hadn't even bothered to verify current staff. When detectives searched Karen's home under warrant, they uncovered a trove of incriminating material, draft documents matching the forged land plans, correspondences with private contractors, and, most troubling, emails between Karen and two members of the HOA board discussing how to quietly acquire the farmer's land under the pretense of community expansion. This was never about vegetables, Deborah said. It was a coordinated effort to seize private land for HOA-controlled development. They wanted to turn your field into tennis courts and a wellness center. The construction crew, too, became a focal point. Half of them had criminal records. The foreman, now facing a separate assault charge for his role in beating Ethan, was found to be unlicensed and hired under a false company name that only existed on paper. The entire operation had been a shadow job, likely paid in cash, orchestrated by Karen using HOA discretionary funds that she had sole access to as president. The HOA scrambled to contain the fallout. Official statements were released, distancing the board from Karen's actions, but Deborah had already subpoenaed internal communications. Several board members had been CC'd on emails that referenced the takeover. Whether through cowardice or complicity, they had allowed it to happen. As Ethan's story gained traction, local news stations picked it up. A humble farmer attacked on his own land by a corrupt HOA president. It was the kind of story that outraged viewers and sparked debate across dinner tables. Neighbors who had once smiled politely now stopped by his gate to offer support, some even bringing pies and casseroles like they were visiting a man who'd survived a tornado. But Ethan didn't feel victorious. Not yet. His fields were scarred. His ribs still ached. And the image of Karen grinning as bulldozers leveled his land still haunted him. He wanted more than justice. He wanted accountability. And with the case moving toward trial, that's exactly what he was going to get. By the time the trial began, Ethan's name was known far beyond the edges of Madison County. News outlets had dubbed him the farmer who fought back, and people across the state tuned in to watch the courtroom showdown between a soft-spoken landowner and a power-drunk HOA president. But Ethan didn't care about the headlines. For him, it wasn't about fame. It was about truth. The courtroom was packed on the first day of proceedings. Karen Mitchell sat stiffly beside her defense team, dressed in a muted gray suit, her expression unreadable. Gone was the confident smirk, the air of superiority. She looked smaller now, as if the walls themselves pressed in on her. Ethan sat across from her at the plaintiff's table, flanked by Deborah Barnes and a second attorney brought in for civil damages. He didn't flinch when their eyes met. He didn't need to. The prosecution built its case methodically. Over the span of a week, they presented irrefutable evidence of Karen's fraudulent documents, her abuse of HOA funds, and the illegal hiring of an unlicensed construction crew. Witness after witness testified, county officials confirming the forgery, neighbors recounting the assault, even former HOA board members who, under threat of perjury, admitted they'd known something was wrong but had stayed silent out of fear or convenience. Then came the footage. Clips from smartphones taken the day of the attack played on a large monitor, Karen watching gleefully as bulldozers tore into Ethan's fields, her voice screeching accusations of sabotage while three men beat him into the dirt. Gasps filled the courtroom. Karen turned away as the footage showed her shrieking at bystanders and threatening those who tried to intervene. Her lawyers tried to object, but the judge allowed the full recording. "The jury deserves to see the reality," he said. All of it. When Ethan took the stand, the room fell silent. He spoke plainly, without dramatics. He described the partnership he'd had with the previous HOA, the betrayal he felt when Karen demanded control, and the horror of watching years of labor destroyed before his eyes. "She didn't want my farm," he said, his voice steady. "She wanted power, and she was willing to lie, steal, and hurt people to get it." Karen's defense was paper thin. Her lawyers argued she believed she was acting within her authority, that the land was disputed, and that the incident was a misunderstanding. But the jury didn't buy it, not with the avalanche of evidence, not with the bruises on Ethan's medical report, not with the trail of forged files and angry emails she had left in her wake. The verdict came swiftly, guilty on multiple felony counts, forgery, criminal trespass, conspiracy, and destruction of property. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison without parole for the physical and financial harm she had caused. The lead construction worker received 8 years for assault and unlicensed operation. Several others were fined and given shorter sentences, while the HOA itself was ordered to pay Ethan over $1.5 million in damages and legal fees. When the judge delivered the final ruling, Ethan didn't cheer. He simply nodded, as if confirming what he'd always known. You don't let someone steal your land. Not with paper, not with machines, and not with threats. Outside the courthouse, a reporter asked how he felt. Ethan just said, "Like I can finally go home." Spring came late that year, but when it did, the land seemed to breathe again. The southern fields were still scarred, the soil torn and uneven, but Ethan Walker wasn't one to let damage sit idle. With the compensation from the lawsuits, he hired a restoration crew, real professionals this time, and began the painstaking work of rebuilding. He reinstalled the irrigation system, replanted fruit trees, and brought in truckloads of nutrient-rich soil to nurse the fields back to life. The community helped too. Dozens of neighbors from Sunridge Hills, many of whom had once been silent bystanders, now showed up with work gloves and coolers full of lemonade. They hammered fence posts, cleared debris, and worked side by side with Ethan until the fields looked less like a battlefield and more like home. But the healing wasn't just physical. In the wake of the trial, Sunridge Hills HOA underwent a massive internal shakeup. The entire board was dissolved by court order, and an independent auditor was brought in to restructure the organization from the ground up. Transparency became the new buzzword. At an emergency community meeting, residents voted to remove any clause in the HOA bylaws that allowed the president unchecked authority. In her place, a temporary committee was formed, composed of longtime residents, people like Marlene, who had warned Ethan that morning, and a new leadership was eventually elected. A week later, Marlene showed up at Ethan's door with a fresh-baked peach cobbler and a nervous smile. "They want to restart the farm partnership," she said. "Back the way it used to be. No contracts, no politics, just trust, like before." Ethan hesitated, then stepped aside to let her in. "Let's talk." By the end of the afternoon, the partnership was reborn. No coercion, no threats, just a simple mutual understanding. Once again, Ethan's pickup made its way to the Sunridge Hills Community Center every Thursday morning, crates of eggs and jars of honey riding in the back. This time, though, residents didn't just smile, they clapped. Some even cried. The man they had nearly lost to corruption had become a symbol of quiet resistance, of standing one's ground when it mattered most. Life, of course, moved on. Karen Mitchell vanished from headlines as quickly as she had entered them, now a prisoner in an upstate facility with 15 years to reflect on her abuse of power. The HOA, once a symbol of control, became something closer to a neighborhood alliance, focused more on potlucks and holiday lights than permits and turf wars. Ethan didn't seek the spotlight, but it found him anyway. Articles were written, interviews requested. He declined most, preferring the company of his goats and the slow rhythm of morning chores. But every now and then, at the farmer's market or the local diner, someone would stop him and say, "You're the guy who stood up to them. You did the right thing." He never quite knew how to respond, but deep down, he knew they were right. Late one evening, as the sun dipped behind the hill and cast golden light across the fields, Ethan leaned on his porch railing, a cold drink in hand. The sound of cicadas hummed softly in the distance. He looked out across the land, his land, restored, defended, and finally at peace. Justice hadn't just been served, it had been planted, and now it was growing.